Okay. One second. Shalom, everyone, to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. Many of you may remember that approximately a month ago, actually exactly a month ago, a very good friend of mine and a few other people who are part of this learning community, a good friend of ours passed away, Rabbi Henoch Dov ben Tzvi Hirsch from Denver. And we dedicated our learning for that whole week. Amy, I see you just came on. We're dedicating the learning to Rabbi Henoch Dov ben Tzvi Hirsch, because tonight begins his, at least here in Israel, it's already night, his 30th day from his passing away. And that is usually a very significant event in the mourning process for the family and for the soul's elevation and what it needs to go through when it passes from this world. So tonight we are going to dedicate our learning to Rebbe Henoch Dov ben Tzvi Hirsch, and he should have an aliyah and his family should be comforted. Amy, we're going to get to it later, okay? Okay, after class, you'll have a chance to speak, okay? Okay, tonight, we are finishing the book of Shoftim. We're finishing the book of Judges. We're on chapters 17 through 21. That's the last chapter. And we have two important incidences to discuss. The first question we could ask, these are very horrific events in Jewish history, especially the second one. And the question is, what is it doing in the book of Judges? Because the Bible, it's a holy book. So we might ask, when we learn this, you'll understand my question. Why did Shmuel, according to tradition, the prophet, the judge Shmuel wrote the book of Judges? That's where we'll be starting next week, in the book of Shmuel. Question is, why did he include these two events when you could say, wouldn't it have been better to like whitewash Jewish history, that we wouldn't have to learn about these terrible incidences in Jewish history? Again, especially the second one. And the answer is that we're going to see there's a certain verse that is repeated at least 3 times in these last 2 chapters, maybe even a 4th time, that states, one second, and it's in the 6th verse of the 17th chapter. And it says this 3 or 4 different times. Biyamim hahem ein melech b'Yisrael, ish yashar be'einav ya'aseh. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every person did what was straight or right in their own eyes. According to tradition, this verse, this sentiment is saying that there was like anarchy, that there's 2 ways to understand. There was no king in Israel. What does the king represent? The king represents order, discipline, law, purpose, mission, unity. All those things are coalesced in the appointment and the stature of the king. So here it says this was before there was a king. We know there were judges. This whole book is called the Book of Judges. There were some great leaders here. But as soon as they passed away, we saw the cycle repeat itself over and over again. Israel would backslide, would not be observing the Torah, and it either brought upon them enemies or God sent enemies. But they're both true. Usually it's the language that God would send an enemy. And the purpose is to get Israel to cry out, realize that they had gone off the path, and then God would send, a judge to save them. So, but here it says there was no king in Israel, because in between each of the judges, the people backslided. The other interpretation is it's talking about the King of Kings, of God. And so when it says there was no king in Israel, meant that Israel didn't acknowledge God as king, which meant that they weren't observing the Torah, and especially the moral and ethical laws of the Torah, and how to set up and run a moral and ethical society. That was lacking. So these last two stories are there to teach us what not to do and the consequences of backsliding. That's what they're there. The first one, like I said, is somewhat milder. The last incident is very traumatic and represents a very, very low in Jewish history, but it's there and it's bracketed by these statements. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what they thought was right, which that doesn't sound so bad, but what it means is that everyone was just doing their own thing, and there was no accountability, and there was no real moral and ethical standards that were being kept at that time. So the first incident starts like this in the 17th chapter, that there was a man from the Mount of Ephraim, and his name was Michayahu, even though the rest of the story is just called Micha. And the first time he's called Michayahu, but after that he's called Micha. And it starts a little bit strange that he came to his mother and said, you know, the 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you and that you cursed whoever took it from you, I have to admit it was me. So here we're starting off. A son is going to his mother and saying, I ripped you off. And, I thought I would get away with it, but you put a curse on anyone who did this, and I don't want to be cursed. So I'm going to give you the money back. And she said, oh, I forgive you. That's very good. But you should know what I was planning to use with part of that money was to make a carved and molten idol. And therefore, she took that money and she made this molten idol, and she gave it to Micha. Micha made a shrine, and he made other ritual items. Here it's called an ephod and a teraphim. Now, teraphim, if you remember, this is what Rachel stole from her father Lavan. They were considered idol worship. And when Yaakov and family ran from Lavan, wanting to get away, and he chased them, And he caught up with them, and among the many things, he said, "Who stole my teraphim? Who stole my idols?" And Yaakov said, "It wasn't any of us. Why would we want your idols? And anyone that did such a thing should die." Now, he didn't know that Rachel had taken the teraphim. That was kind of her way to, her last will and statement against her father. And she took them, but Lavan never discovered them. So I'm only bringing that up because here we see Micha makes some kind of idol worship ritual artifact. And he set up like a little temple. That's how the story begins. Now, I have to mention there's a lot of discussion in the commentaries when this happened. If we're following, this comes after the story of Shimshon. He was the last judge mentioned in the book of Judges. And therefore, some people feel that it's all in chronological order. But the vast majority of commentaries say it is not in order. And they bring as a proof, we'll see it in a minute. I'll go back to it, but there's various proofs here that this happened when Yeshua was still alive or right after he passed away. And it was right after the 7 years of wars of conquest and the 7 years of apportioning the inheritances to each of the tribes. And so most commentaries say this is not in its chronological order. It happened actually hundreds of years before. The whole book of Judges takes place over a few hundred years. It's very important to understand. And so that's the vast majority think that this happened really at the beginning of the book of Judges. And we'll explain in just a few minutes why one of the, we'll call it proofs, that is so. So Micha sets up this temple and he appoints one of his sons to be the Kohen. So in other words, Micha is doing his own thing. That's why it begins by saying in those days, everyone did what they wanted to do. Now, what's interesting, and it needs to be pointed out, that when he sets up this, we'll call it a temple, a Beit Knesset, he called it a Beit Elokim, a house of God. And in another place, it uses the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. And so there's a lot of discussion of, was this really idol worship? Micha is setting up this molten image, and it appears that he's setting up this alternative religion here, even though right now he's the only one worshiping there. But he calls it a house of God. So there is a commentary that it's not like 100% idol worship. It's like partly idol worship, but partly somehow connected to God. Like in Hebrew, the word for idol worship, one of the words for idol worship is avodah zarah. Zarah means strange. Avodah means a service, a strange service. Not just idols, not just statues, just the service of these other gods is what was called strange. Strange to our perception, and of course to the Torah. So I'm going to go back a minute. Those who think that this happened in chronological order, right at the beginning, is that Micha says to his mother the 1,100 pieces of silver that is missing, that was stolen from you, and he admits that he did it. So some people find a connection to the story of Shimshon. If you remember, the Philistines came to Delilah and offered her 1,100 pieces of silver to turn in Shimshon, to reveal what his incredible strength was. So some people say the fact that you have 1,100 stories right next to each other, that is a support for the idea that, no, this happened in chronological order. We'll continue now. So now Micha, and I'll use this opportunity now to try to explain who is this person, Micha. So there is a discussion whether it's the same Micha that I'm going to describe now from the time of Moshe. Now we have to understand that that's why many people think this is not in chronological order, because this is hundreds of years after Moshe. And the Micha that I'm going to explain now, according to the Midrash, is that in Egypt, when part of their cruelty was that they would place, when they needed like filling in the mortar of the walls, and they didn't have enough, they would take, it's a horrible thing, they would take a Jewish baby and stuff it into the wall. Now, we could hear this midrash and think, did that really happen? Like, did the Egyptians really take babies and put them in the wall? Well, we have unfortunately, from just 80 years ago, and there are actually, apparently there's even footage and proof that the Nazis used to do target practice on babies, on Jewish babies, as horrible as that sounds. So if we hear a midrash like this, our first instinct might be like, maybe it's a little bit exaggerated, but just 80 years ago, we saw to what depths so-called human beings can fall to. And it's a known fact that, there were 6 million killed, and there were thousands, tens of thousands of babies. In fact, at Yad Vashem, there's a whole building for the 1.5 million Jewish children who died in the Holocaust. And they have all of their names and many of the pictures. So I'm just bringing this up, that sometimes we hear a midrash and we think, oh, it's a midrash. That means it must be somehow like the symbolic. Anyways, so this is at a time where apparently Moshe is already aware that he is a Jew. He's from Israel, but he hasn't like broken ranks yet. And so he is out inspecting the building projects, and he sees an Egyptian is putting a baby into the wall. And he goes and he wants to save the baby. And the Midrash says that God says, maybe you shouldn't. Now, this sounds also very harsh, that God is saying, maybe you shouldn't interfere. But Moshe is full of compassion. And of course, that's anyone's first gut feeling is to save this baby. So again, this midrash isn't to be taken totally literally. The idea, though, is somehow God was sending a sign that you don't know who this child is. Like, you're going to save this child. It sounds good, but who knows? This is very similar to what happened when Moshe wants to take out the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude. And God says, do not take them. They're not ready. They're not ready to become part of Israel. They're not ready for what is about to happen. And Moshe took them anyways. And according to tradition, the Erev Rav was a source of tremendous opposition in the desert, including the golden calf. So according to tradition, the baby that Moshe saves is Micha. And similar to when Moshe saves a Jew who is being beaten by an Egyptian, and he kills the Egyptian, and the next day he goes out and he sees two Jews fighting. One of them was the one he just saved. And he tries to break it up. And the one that he just saved says, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And Moshe says, and the Torah says, Achein nodeha davar. Therefore, this thing is known. And Moshe has to, the word gets to Pharaoh, and Moshe has to flee. It's a very similar thing. Here, Moshe saves this baby, and it turns out that this baby is instrumental in, making of the golden calf. The Midrash explains that when Moshe, on the night that we were leaving Egypt, Moshe was trying to find the Aron, the casket of Yosef, who had been hidden, and Yosef made the people promise to take him out and bury him in Israel. And according to tradition, it was Serach bat Asher who had the tradition of how to find this casket. And the words, it was on a parchment. Eli shor, rise up ox, rise up ox. Because in Yaakov's blessings to Yosef, he's called an ox, compared to an ox. And according to tradition, Micha is now grown up. He gets his hands on this parchment, and he is the one who throws it into the fire. When Aaron's trying to get rid of the gold, he's stalling. He got everyone to give their gold, all the men at least. The women did not participate. And he tried to get rid of it by throwing it in the fire. But Micha threw this parchment in, and out of it came the golden calf, like an ox, a golden calf. This is the Micha that, according to tradition, we're talking about here. And that's one of the two main reasons people feel this is not in chronological order. This Micha would be hundreds of years old at this point. This must have happened at an earlier juncture. Now we'll continue with the story. I'm going to go a little bit faster here. There's a lot of details in the story, a lot of details, but I do want to finish the book of Shoftim tonight. So then a Levi, someone from the tribe of Levi, comes out of Beit Lechem, Yehuda, and this is happening in the tribe of Ephraim. And Micha sees that he's a Levi, and he says, basically, why don't you become my Kohen? I have this Beit Elohim, and I'm looking for like a real Levi. The Kohanim come from Levi. So I'll pay you to be my Kohen. And he agrees. And so he's now the Kohen of this, we'll call it strange service, which somehow isn't like a total break from God. It's a very confusing idea. But it's called Pesel Micha, the statue of Micha that he had set up. And then comes our second type of support for the idea that this is not written in chronological order. Now it tells about 5 people from the tribe of Dan. And it says that they were not able to establish their inheritance. The question is why? Most likely because we know that Yoshua was not able to conquer all of the people. It wasn't a total conquest. And many of the tribes were more successful than other tribes. But after 7 years, more or less every tribe was on their own to try to move away any one of the nations that were left. And apparently Dan was totally unsuccessful. Now you should know that the Tel Aviv area to this day is called Gush Dan. It's called from the tribe of Dan. And that apparently was their original inheritance, but they were not successful. So they sent 5 spies to try to find someplace to conquer. And they pass by Micha's house. They see what's going on here. Apparently Micha's not around. And they recognize this Levi. And they say, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I've been hired to be the priest of this Beit Elohim. And they say, well, why don't you come with us and let's steal all of these ritual objects, and we'll go find a place to conquer, and you'll be our Kohen. In other words, you won't be a Kohen of this individual Micha. You'll be a Kohen of a whole tribe. And so the Levi says, sounds pretty good to me. Now I'm going to interject. Who is this Levi? What's interesting here is, except for Micha, no one's names are mentioned. And the same thing in the next story. It just says a man, a woman. No names are given except for Micha. So who is this Levi? So the prominent opinion is that this is the grandson of Moshe Rabbeinu. Again, remember, this whole story is being bracketed by, in those days, there was no king in Israel and everyone was just doing their own thing. And as we said, we're learning these stories to see like what happens when there's no king in Israel, whether a real king or the King of Kings. And so according to tradition, the Gemara says he's the son of Manasseh. Of Gershom, Moshe's son. He's the grandson of Moshe. So here we see in just 2 generations how far away from the Torah that they got. It's a sad situation, very sad situation, especially the opinion, which again is the majority opinion, that this is happening right after Yeshua passes away, not that long after Moshe passed away. And already they're like off the derech. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. The other opinion is that he was, and his name is Yonatan. Again, he's not named in the story, but the Gemara says his name was Yonatan ben Menashe, not Gershon. Why Menashe? It's just another opinion. Is because they named him later. Why? Because one of the most evil kings in Israel who promoted idol worship was the king Manasseh. And so kind of retroactively, they called him Yonatan ben Menashe because he became the Kohen of this kind of like other religion that somehow in their twisted minds was somehow connected to God. And that's, I already mentioned the golden calf. And many of the commentaries say that, yes, it was a golden calf, But many people say is that they were just looking for, they were scared. They were looking for a replacement for Moshe. They thought Moshe wasn't coming back. What are we going to do now? What's going to happen to us? So they made this golden calf. They kind of fell back to the Egyptian influence. And yes, it was idol worship. But many commentaries point out, as terrible as it was, one of the greatest stains in Jewish history, that kind of like to what's called melamed zchut, that it was kind of like a backdoor kind of idol worship, that they were just, what are we going to do? Our leader is gone. Who's going to lead us? So that's a little bit connected to this. But yes, it was an idol. It was a strange service. So it's hard to get our hands exactly on this. Okay, this Levi now goes with Dan, and it explains that they went up north, somewhere in the approximate area of Sidon, which is up in Lebanon, and there was a very quiet town up there. And I just want to mention that it says that it mentions that the 600 soldiers from Dan went up north to try to conquer area for the tribe. And it just mentions that they came out of Sora and Eshtaol. Now, these are the same two places that are mentioned by Shimshon. We know that Shimshon comes from Dan, and it mentions that his like Ruach HaKodesh, God's spirit entered into him between these two places. So again, this points out, look what happened here. Shimshon is from Dan. He was a great judge. He was a great redeemer of Israel. And within a short amount of time, they're setting up idol worship. So this whole story is there to teach us what happens when we're not acting properly. That's why Shmuel put it. He could have whitewashed it. We would never have known about this. But he put it here specifically to give it as like rebuke for the Jewish people and as a warning. So the tribe of Dan goes up with these 600 men, and the place that they conquer, it says it a couple of times that they were like nice people. They didn't hurt anyone. They were among the nations, but they weren't among the nations that we were commanded to conquer. And they wiped them out. And also, it was a bit of a rebuke here, because specifically they said it's like a town that didn't hurt anyone. And here Dan goes and they wipe them out. And to this day, there is a place, many people probably have been to it, called Tel Dan, up by the lower Golan. It's about 20 minutes from Kiryat Shmona. I've been there scores of times, which is one of the rivers that feed into the Jordan River. And there's a gorgeous nature reserve there that is just beautiful. One of the places in the reserve is called Gan Eden, called the Garden of Eden. And when you're there, it's like, I can believe it. Right? It's so beautiful, and water running everywhere. It's not like one river. It's Mayanot and rivulets all over the place. All over the place. And part of Tel Dan are ancient archaeological finds that apparently go back all the ways to this story. All the ways back. Okay, and one thing I didn't mention is when they took this Levi and said, "You come with us, and you'll be a priest for a whole tribe." So Micha runs after them and says, "What did you do? You stole my idols." And basically, they answered like, "If you know what's good for you, get out of here. Go back home. We're in charge now." And Micha had no way to defend himself. And so these idols, originally they were called Pesel Micha, ended up north, very possibly exactly where Tel Dan is. And the book of Shoftim says that it existed until the Babylonians, the Assyrians came and took away the 10 tribes, because Dan was now up north. Whatever attempt they made to establish their inheritance in, let's call it the Tel Aviv area, they were now planted up north, and they were taken away with everyone else. And it also mentions that this other service, so this kind of idol worship was happening the same time that the Mishkan was in Shiloh. And again, it's pointing out here you had the Mishkan at Shiloh, and yet you have a whole tribe that, in a sense, try to set up their own kind of religion. Ultimately, it was defeated because the Assyrians took away the tribe of Dan and the other 10 tribes as well. So that's the first incident here. The last one is the last one in the book of Shoftim. And this is a truly a horrendous event in Jewish history. And it begins in the 19th. Wait, one second. Yeah, the beginning of the 19th chapter begins what's called Pelegish Begiva, the concubine from the city of Giva. Giva is in the tribe of Benjamin, and we'll see how important that fact is. And again, a lot of details here, and we're not going to go through every detail. But there was a man from he was a Levi, a Levite. Again, his name is not given. The concubine's name is not given. And the person, we'll see in a minute, who tried to host him is not given. So the story is, that, again, without going into the details, in that day, there was we'll call it a proper wife married according to Jewish tradition. And there was it's not even a secondary wife, it was a different status called a concubine. A concubine could actually, in reality, be like a full wife, but it wasn't through the complete proper Jewish tradition of a full marriage. But if a man and a concubine lived together, they were like man and wife. And we're not going into the halachas right now, but we're gonna call it a quasi marriage, not a full marriage. So the story begins, there's a Levite who has a concubine. And the wording here is that she was unfaithful to him. And the word is the usual word that would be used for adultery or prostitution. And it says that she did such a thing, and then she left him. And then 4 months later, he goes to try to find her, to talk her back into being his concubine. So here the commentaries say, well, if that's true, then the word that is used can't be literal, because in Jewish law, if a woman is guilty of adultery, her husband cannot take her back. And it's the same thing with a concubine. So therefore, the sages say, and we're going to see that this Levi here is no great hero. If you just read it in English, you might not pick up on it so much, but apparently he was very, very strict with her. And some say that she just like burned dinner one night or something, and he exploded against her, and she was afraid and she left. But the sages say that he was very, very strict with her, and they learn, he's the example that it's used, like what could happen if a husband is overly strict with his wife, his children. And this is used as an example. Anyways, he comes back after her, and her father is delighted to see him. And they eat and they drink, and apparently the concubine somehow agrees to go with him. He gets ready to leave, and the father-in-law says, well, stay another day. We're having such a good time here. It's a very strange story. And it turns out he stays for 4 days. Every time he tries to leave, the father-in-law says, no, stay a little bit longer. One of the commentaries is that his daughter didn't have the greatest reputation. And here he thought this would be somehow redeeming her reputation, that maybe she's not a full wife, but she's kind of like a wife. So he wanted the Levi to stay so people would see that, well, maybe she's not so bad after all. Though in the story itself, again, it uses the word that she was unfaithful to him, but the sages didn't understand it that way. They didn't understand that she really was unfaithful in that kind of way. And then finally, I think it was the 5th day, they finally leave. Okay, and he's going back to, he wants to go back to Har Ephraim. They started out in Yehuda. And so he goes, he has his concubine with him, and a helper, servant, whatever. And they pass by Yerushalayim. And so the helper says, why don't we stay here for the night? And there it was called Yevusi. And he says, no, I don't want to stay in this place because we are strangers here. So here is one of the many, let's call it, supports that until David HaMelech, Yerushalayim was not in Jewish hands. Because here, and we're getting towards the time of David HaMelech, but he didn't want to stay there at night because he was a little bit afraid, uncomfortable. We're in a strange nation is ruling over this place. And then it was called Yevusi. So they go on and they come to a place called Giva in Ephraim. And it's night. And he goes to the square and no one's willing to take him in. Apparently he's asking, can someone put us up? Even pay. No one was willing to put them up. And all it says is an old man, again, his name isn't used. An old man sees him and feels bad, and he says, come, stay with me. I'll give you whatever you need. And then what happens is everyone comments on this, all the commentaries. It's almost a replay of what happened in Sodom. This old man takes him in with the concubine and his servant. And it doesn't see, in the story of Sodom, it says, all the people came to the house of Lot and said, bring out this stranger so we can know him. And that in Hebrew, in this context at least, is knowing them sexually. And that's where you get the whole word sodomy. Comes from that incident where they didn't realize they were angels. And so it's almost a replay here. But here it doesn't say all the people. It just says like these gangsters, ruffians came and said, we hear you have strangers here. Bring him out so we can know him. And the old man does exactly what Lot did. Exactly. He said, this man has come under my protection. You can do whatever you want with my daughters. I mean, horrendous. But that's what Lot said. Lot said, I have 2 daughters. They are virgins. Do what you want with them, but don't trouble the stranger. That's exactly what happens here. But what happens, though, is instead, the Levite kind of gives them the Pelegish, the concubine. And it says that they gang raped her the entire night, and apparently it was not a small amount of people. And somehow either they were done with her or she escaped, and she crawled back to this old man's place. And the Levite wakes up in the morning, and here we see he's one of the worst here. And it says he woke up in the morning, meaning he allowed them to take the Pelegish and he went to sleep. Outrageous. Again, Shmuel includes this story as a warning of where you can fall without Torah morals and values. And so he opens the door and he sees the Pelegish is laying there, and he says, get up, we're going now. And then he realizes that she's dead. So he takes her body and he goes back to Har Ephraim. He cuts up the body into 12 pieces, and he sends a piece to each one of the tribes of Israel. It's exactly what the text says, saying, I want to show you what just happened in Israel, in this place in Binyamin. Now, again, he's no great hero here. But here, at least, he's acting with outrage, which is quite hypocritical on his part. And what happened, again, there are a lot of details here. All of Israel is outraged. They gather up an army of 400,000 men from every tribe. Every tribe contributes. And they go to Binyamin and say, turn over the people who did this horrendous thing, and that will be the end of the story. It's not really all that clear, but the people of Binyamin refused, and that set off, quite literally, a civil war. It was 11 tribes versus the tribe of Binyamin. Again, a lot of details here, but what happens is Binyamin gathers 25,000 soldiers, and in the first 2 battles, they are victorious. And after the first battle, it says that they asked of God, like, what do we do now? Like, who should we continue with this? Now it's clear they were asking the Urim and Tumim in Shiloh, like what to do here, and the answer was proceed. The second battle, they lose again. Binyamin is winning the war, even though they're totally outnumbered. And yet the message that they're getting from God is continue. In the third battle, they use a little bit more strategy, and they appear like they're retreating, and they get Binyamin to go away from Giva. That's the city where this horrible thing happened. And then they were able to surround them and totally defeat them. And they burned down Giva and many of the cities of Binyamin. It was a full-out civil war, one of the worst incidences in all of Jewish history. This was not a little skirmish here. This was a full civil war. In the end, and during this time, they make a vow. We will not allow any of our children, any of our men, to marry any of the women from Binyamin. And so in the end, they defeat Binyamin, and there are only 400 soldiers left of the whole tribe. And we're now in the 20th and the 21st chapter. Here, the people are like, wow, what have we done here? There's hardly anything left of one of the tribes of Israel. And so what they decided was that they had taken a vow. In other words, there are 400 men left. Okay, they leave them alone, but there's this vow that of like intermarriage between the tribes. And so this is the same thing with Yiftach. The idea was Yiftach, if you remember, made a vow, the first thing that comes out of my house, I'm going to offer up. And what's the first thing that come out if I win this war? The first thing that came out was his daughter. Now, obviously, he that wasn't his intent. And nonetheless, we learned that he was too proud to go to Pinchas, who was the main leader there, the Kohen. And Pinchas was too proud to go to him, because that kind of a vow where you didn't understand the consequences can be annulled. So here also we have the question, they made a vow, but if they would have realized that it meant that an entire tribe would be wiped out, they probably wouldn't have made the vow. And yet what happens at the end of the story is that they come up with a plan. And the plan is that there was a festival at Shiloh called the Festival of God at Shiloh. And part of the festival is the young women would go out and dance in the vineyards. And so the plan was, let's take, and it ends almost as strange as this whole story started. They said, let's take the 400 men who are left, let them go to this festival, let them, and the words that are used here are grab, steal, force. let them go and take wives and go back to Binyamin and build up the tribe again. And that is exactly what happened. That they, the 400 men that were left, went to this festival. They grabbed women, went back to Binyamin, and they rebuilt the tribe. And the whole book ends, B'yamim hahem ein melech b'Yisrael, ish hayashar be'einav ya'aseh. This is the same verse that this is the third or fourth time in these two stories that it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that's how the book of Shoftim ends. As I said, the first story of the Pesach of Micha is also like a terrible story, but the what's called the Pelegish Begivah is really one of the worst stories in the entire Tanakh. But again, Shmuel puts it there to teach us a host of lessons. There's, again, if we would go back over every verse, we would find so much rebuke here and so much that was going wrong, but is there to teach us of where not to get to. So I wanted to end, though, with a very, very interesting idea here, because this story at the end of the women going down to the vineyard and men going and making shidduchim, even though the language is very strange. It wasn't that they went and people fell in love and they went back with Binyamin. It was a much harsher language, but nonetheless, this should sound familiar to people. This is Tu B'Av. This is the most concrete biblical source for we'll call it a minor holiday of Tu B'Av. Tu B'Av is the 15th of Av. It's approximately a week after Tisha B'Av. And in the Masechet of Ta'anit, the last Mishnah in the tractate of Ta'anit begins by saying there were no two joyous days in all of the calendar as Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur. And so then the Mishnah continues, well, what is this holiday, Tu B'Av? And they explain how the women on this holiday, and it's a full moon of Av, would borrow white clothes from each other. So no one knew, maybe one dress was very plain, one was very elaborate. No one would know who was wearing what. It was all, everyone dressed in white. And they would go down to the vineyards and dance, and the young men would come. But here, it's not any force. It's just the opposite. It was in modern Hebrew, in modern Israel, it's called the holiday of love, Chag Ha'ava, and that was the atmosphere. That was the energy in the air. And there, in the Mishnah, the women were in a certain way enticing the men. Just the opposite. They were telling the men what you should look for in a proper wife. And so I want to end this on a little bit of a higher note here, because everyone talks about this minor holiday called Tu B'Av is one of the most joyous of the year. Like, many people never even heard of it, unless you're like traditional. and you know about Jewish tradition, many people have never even heard of this day, and yet they called it one of the happiest days of the year. So in Tanit, they give 6 different reasons for something that happened on Tu B'Av that would make it a happy day. So I'm going to go through it really, really quickly. The first one is that at the end of the 40 years in the desert, before they come into the land, this has to do with the 5 daughters of Tzlofchad, where the tribe of Manasseh complained that if there's intermarriage between the tribes, and especially if women also get inheritances, then within one generation, we're not going to know who's who. And so there was a decree from Moshe that for one generation, there would be no intermarriage until the physical inheritances in Eretz Israel were set up. That decree was nullified on Tu B'Av. After they had conquered the land and they had made the inheritances, then they annulled that on Tu B'Av. The second one was the story we just learned, that apparently this holiday of God that was happening in Shiloh was happening on Tu B'Av. And so the whole story, both of these first 2 reasons have to do with making matches between men and women. And also, I just want to say that they're doing this, they annulled the decree against allowing Binyamin to intermarry with the other tribes. The third reason is that, and this is a little bit of call it a wild midrash, that when we were in the desert for 40 years, so God had decreed that the whole generation of men between 20 and 60 would pass away. So the midrash says that every year, 15,000 people would dig a grave and lie down in the grave, and in the morning they were all dead. Not an easy midrash to understand. Nonetheless, it says that in the 40th year, the last 15,000, or at least what they thought were the last 15,000, made their graves, lay down in it, and they were alive in the morning. And they thought, well, maybe we miscalculated the date. They would lay down on Tisha B'Av. I should mention that. They would lay down on Tisha B'Av. So they did this for a whole week. It could be that it was very cloudy in the desert. There was a sandstorm. They couldn't see the moon, the sun. But finally, on Tu B'Av, they see the full moon and they realize, oh my gosh, we're still alive. So that decree was also nullified. So we see that all 3 of these have to do with annulment of vows, of decrees. The fourth reason is that the northern kingdom, when it broke free from the southern kingdom, they didn't allow anyone to go to Jerusalem. That was the whole thing. They set up not just the Pesel of Micha, but a whole new kind of religion of the northern tribe. Again, it was somehow connected with Hashem, but it wasn't Judaism as we know it. And many generations later, King Hoshea nullified that decree, and he allowed people from the northern kingdom to go to Jerusalem for Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Another decree that was nullified on Tu B'Av. The fifth reason that's brought is that after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the city, the last holdout was Beitar. Everyone was killed, and the Romans would not allow them to bury the bodies. And they just rotted until the decree was nullified on Tu B'Av, and of course, in a different year. So you see there's a theme here. Nullification of decrees on Tu B'Av. And the last reason that the sages bring is that it was considered a great privilege to bring wood to the temple for the offerings. It was like giving money. You would bring wood that would be burned on the altar. But the cutoff date for bringing wood was on Tu B'Av, because it's considered after Tu B'Av, the sun begins to slightly wane. It's at the end of the summer. And the wood wouldn't be properly, if you cut a tree, there wouldn't be enough time for the sun to dry it properly to burn the way it should on the altar. So here it's not a decree that is nullified, but it's a cutoff date. I'm going to add, that's 6 reasons that the Gemara gives for Tu B'Av, and you put them all together, it was like great reasons to be joyous. But when you really think about it, if you look at Jewish history, these 6 things are not necessarily coming together to make it the most joyous day of the year. So I would propose that they made Tu B'Av one of the most joyous days because it's only a week after Tisha B'Av. It's only a week later. Tisha B'Av is truly the lowest point of the year. We're sitting on the floor fasting. Book of Lamentations. People need hope. People need a reason to celebrate. So a week later, that's what I think, that the sages put together all these reasons which are legitimate and made this minor holiday of Tu B'Av. So there we'll end with on a high note. Again, I just want to end that the learning tonight was in memory of Reb Henoch Dov ben Tzvi Hirsch. Should have an Aliyat HaNeshama. Next week, we begin the book of Shmuel. Welcome everyone to Insights to the weekly Haftarah. This week's Parsha is Parshat Bo, in which the last 3 of the plagues occur. Last week were the first, this week the last 3. In fact, there's a hint to it. It says, Bo el Paro, come to Paro. Well, the gematria of Bo is 3. So it's brought down that the last 3 plagues are in the Parsha of Bo. And towards the end of the Parsha, we get instructions to leave Egypt. And basically, we're on our way out by the end of the Parsha. It's like the first Seder, where we take the blood and we put it over the doorposts and the lintels. We eat matzah. We have Korban Pesach, and the last of the plagues, and Pharaoh tells us to leave. So obviously the Haftarah is going to be somehow connected. And it's from Yirmiyahu, the 46th chapter, starting in the 13th verse. And in a certain way, it's a continuation of last week's Haftarah. Last week's Haftarah was from Yechezkel, Ezekiel, but it has the exact same theme as this week. Now, I pointed out last week that Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu prophesied basically at the same time. They're prophesying right before the destruction of the temple. The difference is 10 years before Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple, he begins the exile of the Jews, even before the temple is destroyed. And they began with approximately 3,000 Jews mostly from the Kohanim and the Leviim and what's called the upper classes, from the rich, the Kohanim and the Leviim. And Yechezkel was a Kohen, and he was one of them. So he was in Babylonia when the temple was destroyed. Jeremiah didn't leave. He was there during the destruction, but they're basically prophesying at the same time. And you could see the comparisons of these two haftarahs, because obviously the Parsha of Bo is about the fall of Egypt, the destruction of Egypt through the plagues. So both Yechezkel last week and in this week's Parsha, Yirmiyahu is prophesying against Egypt. Egypt at that time was a rival to Babylonia. These are the two big empires. And both Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu are prophesying against Egypt and saying, you think you're so powerful. You're on the top of the world. And in fact, both are warning Israel, because Israel sees Babylonia is coming and sees that they've conquered a good part of the ancient world. And they're hoping that somehow Egypt will be some kind of help to them. But both Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu make it very, very clear, Israel, do not depend on Egypt. Babylonia is going to destroy Egypt. So obviously that is why this Haftarah is chosen, but it's talking about the Egypt of their day, right before the destruction of the temple. Now there's something very interesting in the 20th verse. It says, Egla Yafeh Piha Mitzrayim, Karatz Mitzrayim, Ba. It says Egypt is a beautiful calf. Now, for those who were just in the previous class, I just mentioned that the idea of the golden calf is borrowing a little bit from the idol worship influence of Egypt. So here Yirmiyahu says Egypt is a beautiful calf, but a goring horn from the north is coming. A second time in the 24th verse, it says, the daughter of Egypt shall be humiliated, delivered into the hand of a northern people. So this is very interesting because a few haftarahs before that of Shemot, so this is 3 in a row, remember we learned that the Ashkenaz and Sfard have a different haftarah for Parshat Shemot. And the one for Sfard, or Sfardi, is from Yirmiyahu, from the first chapter, when God is choosing him. And we learned this, but I'm going to go over this because it's really connected. 2 times, Yirmiyahu warns Egypt that your destruction is coming from the north. And so when God tells Yirmiyahu, I've chosen you to be a prophet, and Yirmiyahu is like Moshe, trying to somehow get out of it. So God, like very patiently, is teaching Yirmiyahu how to be a prophet. And so he says, Yirmiyahu, what do you see? And he says, I see a almond tree. And God says, very good, Yirmiyahu. because the prophecy I'm about to give you, I'm going to quicken it. And remember, we learned that the almond tree in Hebrew is called shkedia, and the root of shkedia means to quicken, because the almond tree is the first tree to blossom. It's quick to blossom in the spring. And I can testify to that because I go out walking most mornings, and the almond trees are putting out their blossoms, just starting, but some of the trees are full already. It's absolutely amazing. We're in January, and the almond trees are in bloom already. And then God says, Yirmiyahu, what else do you see? And he says, I see a pot with its spout in the direction of the north. That's why I'm bringing this. And God says, very good, Yirmiyahu, because destruction will come from the north. So this is interesting, because that's 2 times Yirmiyahu is telling Egypt, your destruction is coming from the north. But it also means Israel's destruction is coming from the north. And we'll see that at the very end of this Haftorah. So it says it twice. It says, V'ata al tira avdi Yaakov. And now, don't be afraid, Yaakov, my servant. And it says it a second time. And just a few verses later, it says the same thing. Ata al tira avdi Yaakov. And you, don't be afraid, Yaakov. But it ends with a very important statement, an incredibly important statement, where it says, you be not afraid, my servant Yaakov, the words of Hashem, for I am with you, though I shall make an end of all the nations where I have scattered you. I shall not make an end to you. I shall punish you with justice, but I shall not destroy you utterly. Now, it's very harsh language, but translated into Jewish history, what God is saying is the world is working according to measure for measure. You've gone off the path. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, all of them were warning Israel, you're heading for disaster. You're heading for destruction. You're not fulfilling the covenant with God. And what's going to happen is enemies are going to come and destroy you and send you into exile. So here we have the same idea. The language is God is saying, I am doing it. But at the very same time, we can understand that this is just the laws of the universe, the spiritual laws of the universe. We say it in the Shema every day. You do the Torah, you stick with God, everything will be good. And if you don't, this is what's going to happen. The whole book of Devarim is like this. It's a harsh reality. But here, God is saying, I will punish you with justice. In other words, that is what Mida Keneged Mida is based on. There's the laws of, we'll call it here, justice. But God says, don't worry. You will never be destroyed. And this and all of the prophets prophesied of the Messianic era and the final redemption. And so this is how the Haftorah ends. But here I want to add something, is that some of you may be aware of this, but Motzi Shabbos, depending on the community, depending on the individual or the family, many people sing certain songs on Motzi Shabbos. One of them that is close to universal is for Eliyahu Navi, because we're told that Mashiach will not come on Shabbos. Some people say, why? And one of the answers is because on Shabbos, he's there already. Shabbos we're living the Messianic era on Shabbos. So one of the songs is, many different tunes, but to sing for Eliyahu Navi, because now it's Saturday night, and now Mashiach could come, but Eliyahu has to come first. But one of the songs that many people sing is from this Haftarah, and that is Al Tira Avdi Yaakov. That's why I just mentioned it. It comes twice, one right after the other. God is saying, don't be afraid, Yaakov. Your exile will be harsh, but I will never leave you. And so this song goes according to the Aleph Bet. The first verse begins with an Aleph, a Bet. I'll just do a few of them. It's like short kind of poetry. Amar Hashem liYaakov, Al Tira Avdi Yaakov. Bachar Hashem biYaakov, Al Tira Avdi Yaakov. Of course, people sing this. There are all kinds of nigunim. Goel Hashem et Yaakov, Al Tira Avdi Yaakov. Dorach Kochav miYaakov, Al Tira Avdi Yaakov. Each one of these beginnings is from a verse somewhere in the Tanakh. And it goes to the whole Aleph Bet. And so here we see I'm trying to point out in these insights into the Haftarah that almost every single one of the Haftarahs has some famous verse, I don't know if that's the right word, important verse, important concept. And it's not just we just read it on that Shabbat, but these Haftarahs were chosen specifically. And when we go through the whole year, we'll see how many important concepts are enunciated in these different stories.